Good morning, evening. Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. Busy week last week, so I want to cover the past week as well as preview week 5 and also cover the paper, topic, or presentation, depending on what you're doing for this upcoming week. So, Iraq WMD. So there was failures again all along the lines, and it's critical that you understand again where in the collection cycle or in the intel cycle the failures occurred. And there were certainly failures in collection. Just a couple of examples: we did not have any collection assets, real human assets, until the UN when the UN inspectors were ejected out, and the documentary covered that in pretty good detail. There was failures in curveball, really just incompetent collection human tradecraft that resulted in just bad interrogation and that information getting disseminated improperly. So there's again failures at the front end, failures in analyzing signals intelligence that's covered in the Senate Select Committee. Analytical failures, plenty of them to go around. There was massive groupthink, particularly around the aluminum tubes that many of you discussed in the discussion section. There was failures in interpreting Iraqi intentions when they thought that they were covering up their WMD program to prevent them from UN inspectors. No, they were U.S. analysts were essentially mirror imaging. They thought that Iraq's focus was on the United States, when in fact Iraq's focus and their deception around their WMD was to make sure their neighbors, Iran particularly, was fearing a false WMD program. So these were, again, the critical failures. We also looked at failures in accounting that we assumed that if Iraq doesn't have this amount, but they accounted for, previously had this amount of WMD, we assumed that they were hiding the rest, when that simply wasn't true. Those were basic analytical failures that occurred. There were organizational failures, and this is brought up in the Rachel Maddow documentary, but to emphasize, if George Tenet says slam dunk in the Oval Office, that's the final word on intelligence. Many of you have taken the psychology class previously, and we talked about structured analytical techniques in this previous class, whether it's Team A, Team B, red teaming, alternative competitive hypothesis. We talked about all those, but those don't matter if the guy in the room says there's WMD. That's a failure in organization where you are reliant on George Tenet, in this case, George Tenet's, his interpretations and his biases and his clientelism, which was emphasized in the Rachel Maddow documentary. You are dependent on that. So those are organizational failures. And then the policy interface, which the Maddow documentary goes into detail. And I ask, was there a problem in interpreting, or was let me put it this way, there might not have been politicization in the sense that politicians were specifically altering assessments from the intelligence community. However, there certainly was pressure to get the right assessments to the right people. And what I mean by that is, if you're an intel analyst in Defense Intelligence Agency or CIA, and you do a lot of work, and you know your work is only going to get read if it says that Iraq has WMD, then that's going to be in the back of your mind. As much as we like to say truth to power and having alternative analysis, let's face it, we're all creatures. We want to impress our boss. We want our work to get recognized. And that was kind of a sense of an underhanded politicization. So the next case study, again, 9/11, and just some key questions. Was 9/11 an intelligence failure? You can argue no. Not all bad things that happen are intelligence failures. But when I saw the NSA documentary, the Nova documentary on NSA, and they saw that 2 known hijackers were in the United States, and that those hijackers were communicating with a known safe house in Yemen from San Diego. And that was, our intelligence agencies were aware of that. That's an intelligence failure. Um, that's that's something that you should be aware of, and we'll talk more about that in the following week. But I would think that crosses the threshold. What did it do when Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S.? That was in the National Geographic article or documentary. Um, I think the documentary makes Bush, puts a lot of blame on Bush, like he was warned ahead of time. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there was that statement down there is far too vague for any president to have taken reasonable actions. I emphasize that word again. Um, so I always ask, if you're going to make a statement like that, whether it's terrorism, whether you're being aware of a cyber threat, whether you're uh, proposing a business course of action, for those of you in the business field, always have a recommendation. Allow the client that you're briefing, allow him to, or he or she, to bracket the problem so he knows that, okay, you give this recommendation to the president, and then you can say, and sir, I would recommend increasing airline security, up to the next level, something along those lines. Um, so be aware of that when you're making these broad sweeping statements. And then the organizational issues, I just talked about that in the NSA documentary. There was information in one part of our government that could have stopped the 9/11 plot, but because of bureaucracy and classification and interagency politics, that wasn't disseminated to someone that could actually action it. And that's an organizational issue, that the right people weren't talking to uh, the right people weren't talking to each other. And then I always ask, where along the chain could the federal, state, and government have prevented 9/11? I'll let you decide that, and you can bring that up in any final papers. But that there was, as I mentioned, 10 things that needed to happen for the 9/11 terrorists to conduct their attack. All 10 had to happen at that time, right place. Any chain, any scrutiny, any small physical security measures would have broken the 9/11 plot. So I ask, where in the chain, where the information chain between areas of government could have stopped the 9/11, and that's just to think about in the future when we talk about intelligence reform. So paper two. So it's a strategic paper based on the case studies. Do only the case study. Well, if you're going to do a case study that we didn't talk about in week 1 through 4, let me know now, so that I can give you permission, whether it's a real case study. So that's a strategic paper. I will allow you in the write up. I say, you can choose a case study and go in depth. I'll also allow you, if you want to choose an intelligence issue and talk about it through 3 or 4 case studies, if you want. Whether it's you want to talk about, if you want to talk about groupthink specifically, or you want to talk about organizational issues or failures in collection. So if you want to talk about that, I will allow you to do that through multiple case studies as well. And what I want is, I'm going to give you some examples here that we've talked about that shows the failures along the chain. I do not want a laundry list. I do not want a laundry list. I want you to focus on 2, maybe 3 issues. In your discussion sections, that's fine. If you talked about Pearl Harbor or Yom Kippur War, and you gave me, here are 15 indicators that they should have been followed. Do not do that to me for the final. Pick 2 case study or 2 issues and show in depth how they could have been implemented to mitigate risk. I can't emphasize that enough. So failures in collection. Again, these are some of the ones we talked about: Pearl Harbor, the carriers, the inability to monitor the critical Japanese strategic asset; the Yom Kippur, the over-reliance on one human source, as you saw in the documentary on the Yom Kippur War; and the Iraq War, the human that we discussed in the last section. Failures in analysis. Again, the Pearl Harbor case study brought up numerous failures that you all talked about in your indicators. The confessions, whether it was vividness bias, groupthink, confirmation bias, all contributed to the failure, to that case study failure. Iraq WMD, again, the groupthink that I just talked about now, particularly as it relates to the aluminum tubes. Again, failures in analysis all along the chain. Failures in the policy interface. Iraq WMD, we just talked about that a second ago. In the confessions, the clientelism showed by Detective Ford and the pressure that brought out not just Detective Ford but prosecutors and others to get those convictions. And then the 9/11 case study where I just talked about not communicating with specificity regarding the threat, and that was the bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. So that, there's failures in that respect. Failures in organization. The 9/11 NSA document, I just talked about the boxes not being appropriate. Pearl Harbor, again, information was collected at the federal level and it was known about the threat, but it was not disseminated down to the commanders on the ground. And then organization, again, the fusion centers, I bring that up. You saw a bit of that in the last week. But in this case, information is collected at the federal level, whether it's about 9/11 or even in our current terrorism analysis, but it's not pushed down to state and local officials for them to action. So that's a failure in organization, a failure in people not collecting information but not disseminating it or talking to the right people. So that's, again, paper 2 in a nutshell. If there's questions or issues, feel free to call me this week. Feel free to email me. Feel free to do anything if there's any clarity issues. And I look forward to the presentations this week. If you're in those groups, please get the slides to me ahead of time, and I will send the link to you. The link's already in the announcements, but I'll resend it to you where we're going to meet this week for our first live Zoom session. If you're briefing, again, 20 minutes, plan 20 minutes for your briefing. That gives about 5 minutes for questions as well. So we'll go through 3 briefs this coming week. And then unfortunately, because of our compressed schedule, there's no break. I'd love to give you a break so you can review for the entire week and do your papers on the week, but the compressed schedule will not allow that. So week 5, counterterrorism case studies, Fort Hood, underwear bomber, Boston, EU. Again, 4 case studies on counterterrorism. The readings you can see right there, and the documentaries are excellent documentaries, really well done. Please watch them. Again, and they're very, very interesting on the potential threats out there. And the question as you're going through these is, why do we still have these failures? What is the issue that still causes Intel failures to occur 20 years after 9/11? So I look forward to the Zoom sessions this week, and as I said, if there's questions or issues, let me know.